So for me, King's will always be a place of warm memories. It was on another October day, 4 decades ago, that I went up to Cambridge to read for the mathematical tripos. In 1984, I arrived at that gate where I came in today from a small coal mining village in Yorkshire with my happy but nervous parents in tow. Some of you may have just gone through that same experience. I was the first in my family line to go to university, so it was a moment of great anticipation and anxiety for them as much as for me as I crossed that threshold. But we need not have worried. From day one, I could not have felt more at home in this college, nor more welcomed by the students, the fellows, and the staff. And arriving at King's on that first day, and then as time passed, and even a little bit today, I always had a sense of wonder, wandering around, coming in, looking at the Porter's Lodge, and thinking, I maybe don't know what comes next, or what I will learn, or where I'll go, but I sure am excited to find out. And it's a really great institution like King's that can make you feel that way, and I'm very thankful for the experience and the education I had here. Well, the journey, intellectual or otherwise, hopefully never ends for me or for you, and I feel fortunate to be back today following a career that has taken me around the world, studying and researching economics as an academic, and now, since last year, as a policymaker on the Bank of England's Monetary Policy Committee. Now, maybe drawing on these recollections of 40 years ago is a bit of a nostalgia trip, but when you get to my age, you will also look back. And for me, it also brings powerful reminders of the enormous changes that we have seen in our lives since then, at home and across the world. That is true not least when it comes to the international economy, which has dramatically globalized in my lifetime. And that, as you might suspect, is the segue I need to introduce the topic of my remarks today. I want to focus on one very important issue, the dramatic and disruptive developments we are now witnessing in international trade, and how they may impact the world and especially the UK economy in the months and years ahead. And I'll conclude with a discussion of the implications for monetary policy. Specifically, I want to speak about trade diversion, what it is and why it matters. First, an overview. Trade diversion is a phenomenon where, due to changes in trade policy, tariffs, quotas or other barriers, exporters are incentivized to redirect goods to different markets when their usual markets become more expensive to access. The process may happen sequentially if the set of countries imposing tariffs expands. It is therefore an almost certain outcome of the stream of trade policy actions we are now seeing unfold around the world. And the only question is one of magnitude. So here's a little outline of where we're going, and I'm going to start with this discussion of trade diversion as a general overview, then talk about talk about the theory, and then the history, and then where we are now. And let me turn to this chart 1. This shows that recently the US has imposed historically high and broad tariffs, for example on specific products like steel, aluminum, autos and various other items, but also blanket rates across the board on all exports from many countries. The current estimate as of now of the average effective US tariff on all imports is 18% versus 2.5% 1 year ago, so an almost tenfold increase. For some countries, of course, the current levels of tariffs set by the US are much higher than this average. The estimated average effective tariff is 28% for China, where specific tariffs of 30 to 35% have been imposed on most goods, plus some sectoral tariffs, with even higher levels postponed pending ongoing negotiations. And some other countries also face high tariffs, like India, where 2 rounds of 25% tariffs for a total of 50% have been implemented. These tariffs make traditional export flows into the US more costly, pushing exporters, some of them very large in scale, to seek alternative markets. Trade is going through what might be called a great rearrangement, a term that McKinsey came up with, and it remains to be seen how much of this trade is at best diverted or at worst destroyed. What will this mean? Well, in terms of inefficiency, we're going to have more barriers, and that's going to leave the world worse off. I'm also going to want to focus especially on what it means for prices and inflation, the major concern of the Bank of England. For third countries, like us, trade diversion in reaction to an increase in trade barriers is most likely to have disinflationary effects because, from their perspective, our perspective, incoming goods supply increases in the near term as trade is diverted towards us. That is going to be the main argument. Now, those kinds of effects may not be entirely welcome. For example, concerns about trade diversion from the US to European markets have led the US to recently create an import surveillance task force, which is monitoring trade flows and trying to identify instances of dumping. And some EU measures are in place and many more may follow, as we shall see later. Logically, that could divert trade even more into fourth countries, which again would be like the UK, where we are currently maintaining an open posture in terms of trade policy. So in short, if trade diversion happens on a material scale in the UK, or in our closest major trading partner, the EU, then it is likely to have substantial bearing on prices faced by firms and households in the UK economy for both final and intermediate goods. These developments in turn would have implications for future economic prospects and most importantly for the future path of inflation. And that is what matters for the MPC and its key mandate for low and stable inflation at the 2% target. So with that summary and overview of trade diversion, let me try to look at the question in a bit more detail, and as I often do, as a way of organising my thoughts, as I said on the earlier slide, I'm going to look at it first through the lens of theory, then through the lens of history, and then the evidence in real time as we see it today. So let me take each in turn. Trade diversion in theory. In terms of that, I want to walk through the basic idea behind trade diversion, which dates back 75 years, to pioneering work by the economist Jacob Viner in 1950. Now, he was living in another era, but it was also a time of great, large-scale trade disruption in his lifetime. In the 1930s, the world was emerging from that Great Depression period. There'd been large waves of protectionism in the 1920s, and there was an attempt ongoing at that point to begin and construct a post-war multilateral trading order built around the GATT, later the WTO. And that was going to be bound together by a glue of non-discriminatory, most favored nation rules. But Viner, interestingly, had glimpsed something slightly different, and he had identified a weak link. That as an exception, under GATT and ever since, blocks of countries might form customs unions or free trade areas, as a group of 6 European countries would in 1957, a few years after he wrote the book, and that marked the origins of today's EU. So Viner set to work on the theory, deriving the implications, new ideas that could not be seen in the classic two-country trade model. For his logic, for this problem, you needed at least 3 countries. And there followed then a set of classic economic lessons epitomizing the theory of the second best. Trade might be created within a free trade bloc or a customs union, as internal barriers fell, and that creation effect should be welfare improving. But trade would also be diverted as trading partners outside the bloc might see their trading frictions increase, and that diversion effect would be welfare reducing. And these countervailing forces would have to be weighed up. So let me try and sketch this idea in a simplified partial equilibrium setting using a simple supply and demand diagram, as here. I'm going to make a couple of important simplifying assumptions, which we can go back to later. We'll have 3 countries, 1, 2, 3, a global numeraire good in the background, and we can just assume balanced trade for now. The home country is 1, and we import from country 3, as does country 2. And initially there's free trade with no frictions. So this chart shows an initial equilibrium with no tariffs at point A. S3 is the export supply from country 3. And A is the point where it meets D1 plus D2, the 2 demand curves, import demand curves, for countries 1 and 2. Absent tariffs, the world price is P, and that price is the same in all countries. Country 3 exports X3, and focusing on the home country imports M1, leaving the remainder, the distance between A and B, to be imported by country 2. So now suppose country 2 imposes a positive import tariff, T. The price P will now denote the price in the free trade countries that remain, 1 and 3. But the post-tariff price in country 2 is higher at P plus T. Thus, as a function of the price P, the price in 1 and 3, the actual demand for imports in country 2 shifts in to d2 prime, a function of p, which is equal to d2 evaluated at p plus the tariff t. And in that new world equilibrium, we're at point A primed, and the demand drop induces a lower price P primed in both countries 1 and 3. But the post-tariff price in country 2 is higher at P prime plus T. Total exports from country 3, the exporter in this model, decrease to X3 primed, but total imports in country 1 increase to M1 primed. Globally, trade is falling, trade destruction. But locally, for the bystander country, which is country 1 here, imports are actually rising, which is trade diversion. Home import quantities rise and import prices fall. Now, I think despite its simplicity, this is a helpful device to think about the first-order impact of asymmetric tariffs on trade flows and prices in a multi-country setting. And I will argue further that for the bigger and more important policy question, could these effects be potentially large? The answer is going to be yes, and I'll try to make that point in a couple of ways shortly. But I said I would get back to our assumptions, and so I'm going to detour with a couple of caveats. The first important caveat concerns balanced versus imbalanced trade. Classical trade theory usually starts from an assumption of balanced trade, that is, countries do not run persistent trade deficits or surpluses, whereas international macroeconomics now tends to treat intertemporal trade and imbalances as the central case. A classic paper 25 years ago by Obstfeld and Rugoff was a rare attempt to draw the link to explain how lowering frictions in trade would tend to go hand in hand with wider global imbalances. Higher frictions logically go in the opposite way, and trivially, tariffs that are so high as to be prohibitive would mean autarky. And then not just trade balances, but trade itself would be forced to zero. So by implication, local changes in tariffs near zero might have second-order effects, but in terms of their effects on imbalances, but the response has to be non-linear as tariffs get bigger and bigger. And in the end, will shut down trade completely. And some new work by Costaneau and Werning digs in a bit deeper into this problem and finds that large tariffs can have wealth effects which will impact trade imbalances. And those responses will depend on the sensitivity of consumption patterns to those wealth changes. The second caveat concerns my invocation of numeraire a while back, whereas, of course, we have a world of currencies. And the standard result, or standard argument here, is that these changes could be undercut by movements in exchange rates. And in this analysis, the exchange rate was ignored. But the classic argument is, if we're in a macro world with fixed saving and investment imbalances, then on the macro side, this country just wants to run a trade deficit. And so the imbalance must reassert itself, and in equilibrium, the exchange rate in the country that imposes the tariff will appreciate to restore the quantity imbalance. And that's what the textbook says. But in 2025, that forecast, as applied to the US, went a bit awry because we didn't see dollar strength. We actually saw dollar depreciation. Now, caeteris may not be paribus, but the classic argument may just not be right after all. Recent research has made the point that the exchange rate effect need not be a full offset. And as we just said a moment ago, a prohibitive tariff clearly would override all the logic of the offset, and it would get rid of the imbalances. But we also now better understand the connections between wealth effects and exchange rates, given net and gross international asset positions. And recent work by Itzkoki and Mukin highlights this mechanism, noting the role of large US dollar liabilities abroad, and incorporating other drivers of exchange rates and risk premia. So despite the old conventional wisdom, in these more complex settings, the exchange rate offset may not operate, or may not operate fully, which matches what we have been seeing this year. So that's my little tour of theory. Let me now turn to my second lens, which is going to be history and some lessons from history. So I think the basic economic analysis can be a guide, and we can argue that these tariff shocks will make an impact, but how big an impact? How big is big likely to be? Well, we could seek a historical laboratory. And as we consider this, an obvious place to look is the experience of the 1930s, the last time that tariffs were raised around the world to the sorts of levels we're seeing today. And it was also a time, I will argue, when the mechanics of trade diversion went to work in a big way. Now, real economic activity collapsed in the 1930s, and thus trade volumes mechanically fell in part as a result of the contraction in economic activity. So some observers and many economic historians haven't focused on trade diversion. They've just seen trade policy as a kind of smaller part of a much bigger narrative of the Great Depression. And most analysis was aggregative and missed some of the important channels where we might see trade diversion. But recent research, a paper by a team of authors, including my colleague and co-author Kevin O'Rourke, published in the American Economic Review in 2019, studied UK trade flows at the disaggregated level in the 1920s and 30s, and at a much more granular level than any prior study, and provides sharp evidence of the role of tariffs in creating trade diversion. So what was happening in the 1930s? The world trading system was rapidly becoming insular through multiple and often retaliatory beggar-thy-neighbor policies. So the US famously imposed the Smoot-Hawley tariffs at levels similar to those seen today. But other trading partners, trading blocs, were also putting up barriers. At a 1932 conference in Ottawa, the UK brought in imperial preferences, lowering tariffs within the empire, but seeking to boost intra-empire trade at the expense of trade with countries outside the empire. The UK was trying to offset a slump at home. So it raised tariffs on imports from all the other countries outside the empire. And here's a table from that paper showing the nature of trade shifts during the 1930s. And taking the evidence into a model, the evidence for trade diversion is compelling. They used disaggregated UK trade data for 258 goods at a disaggregation at 42 trading partners from 1924 to 1938. About halfway through that is when the tariff policy goes into effect. The authors used a state-of-the-art empirical setup for calibration and found a large impact of these trade policies during this shift towards protectionism. In terms of the aggregate effect, the changes in tariffs in this period can account for about 1/4 of the decline in total UK imports between 1929 and 1933, in line with results from other studies and for other countries, including the US. But that's not the question we're interested in. More importantly for us, this study was also able to look at how these discriminatory tariffs and quotas imposed by the UK shifted the origins of imports towards the British Empire. And the central estimate here suggests that the protectionist shift in UK trade policy can explain more than 70% of this shift in the empire's share of UK imports between 1930 and 1933, and well over half of the shift towards empire by 1938. So this was a profound shift, and it's shown here in Table 1, reproduced from the paper. UK imports from formal and informal empire trading partners rose from 30% in 1929 to 42% in 1938, a very significant change in trade flows, that percentage going up by a factor of 1.4. And similar shifts were happening across the globe, of course. In France, for example, import share from formal and informal empire trading partners more than doubled, from 12 to 26%. And as each bloc turned inward, the effects of trade diversion on themselves and all the other blocs just got bigger and bigger and got more amplified. So trade diversion showed itself on a large scale in the 1930s, just not immediately, but slowly and inexorably as exporters and importers adjusted over a period of years, a better part of a decade. So the first historical lesson here is that the effects of trade diversion can be large when tariffs of the kind of magnitude we're seeing today are imposed. It's an example of that. And the second historical lesson is that these effects can take time to gradually materialize, as the rearrangement of trade patterns on this kind of scale happens only gradually. So prices and quantities will grind very slowly towards that new equilibrium. Now, history does not repeat, and the 1930s are not a simple predictor of what will happen today. For example, as I said, in the 1930s, the turn to protectionism was mostly symmetric, whereas today it's quite asymmetric, which is an important difference. But this focused study, I think, is useful to remind us that when you do have large tariffs of the magnitude we see today, then it can cause gradual but substantial rearrangements of trade in line with the trade diversion theory. Okay, so now onto the final lens, which is what about today? That was then, what about now? Are we starting to see signs of this happening? So I want to try and draw from current, imperfect, and constantly expanding assemblages of real-time information, which I'm poring over, as are my colleagues at the bank, to try and get the best sense of the extent to which we are now seeing these forces of trade diversion at work. So let me point to a few pieces of incoming data. Let's look first at the origin of these tariffs, the US, and this chart 3 shows the value of US imports of Chinese goods as reported by US Census Bureau since the year 2000. We can clearly see the growing importance of the trade between China and the US over the last 25 years, and especially after Chinese accession to the WTO. It was briefly interrupted by the financial crisis, and there's volatility, there's COVID, but tens of billions of dollars worth of goods were flowing from China into the US every month. But we can also see right at the very end the profound impact that the newly imposed tariffs between China and the US have had on these bilateral trade flows. In the span of a few months, imports from China have just about halved and now sit at maybe, what, a 2005 level? So we've gone backwards to pre-global financial crisis flows of trade here. Now, the next logical question must be, where are all those goods going, if not to the US? Contrary to what one might expect, Chinese exports to the world are up about 4% in the year to August, despite the drop in US demand. And in this next chart, I'm decomposing growth in Chinese exports into different regions. Exports to the US are in orange and clearly contribute negatively since April of this year. But we can also see, however, that they have been more than offset by increasing exports to the rest of the world, mainly other Asian economies, but also Europe. Okay, going a bit more granular in the next chart, chart 5, shows the contribution of some selected countries and regions to Chinese export growth in February to August of 2025, that is, the months after the introductions of the tariffs, relative to the same period last year, 2024. Again, a second part of our theory stays intact. Instead of restricting production, the Chinese exporters are finding alternative buyers to sell to. The EU plays a non-trivial role here, as does the UK once we adjust for the relative size of the receiving region. Okay, so that's all about quantities. What about prices? There are good reasons why we should maybe see trade diversion show up first in quantities and only later in prices, with a lag. After all, prices are sticky and may be determined often by infrequently renewed contracts. And all that's in contrast to the equilibrium theory we just discussed, where prices just adjust immediately alongside quantities. Still, there is some evidence that prices are starting to move in this new reality of world trade. So this chart 6, it's showing prices for Chinese trade goods, both from the exporter's perspective on the left and the importer's perspective on the right. Now for the exporter, China, prices are little changed since the start of the year, and since the renminbi has been flat vis-a-vis the dollar, so are Chinese export prices in dollar terms. However, the renminbi has depreciated significantly against European currencies, so for the UK or Euro area buyers, the Chinese goods have become relatively cheaper. And we can begin to see some of that effect show up in domestic import prices on the right-hand side. There's now a large gap between price developments for the US for all import goods, which is the solid aqua line, and those imports that are coming specifically from China, the dotted aqua line. Notably, however, going the other way, European imports from China have also already become relatively cheaper. So it seems like there are tentative signs that the final theoretical prediction is coming through as well, and that tariffs between some countries will spill over into price drops in third countries due to trade diversion. And there is narrative evidence to confirm this in terms of the redirection of trade flows to the EU and the lowering of prices of these goods. It's not gone unnoticed by the EU authorities at a time when the new Import Surveillance Task Force is monitoring for trade diversion. Here is their latest heat map with China highlighted in the red rectangle. And this speaks to growing concerns about import surges with trade flows here in various categories of goods and sectors on the left column there highlighted. The rise in EU trade policy actions is also notable. In the news section of the Commission's website, it is listed as taking 6 actions in the entire calendar year of 2024, last year. But this year it took less than 2 months to take six actions in 2025, and over the first 9 months of 2025, up to last week when I looked at the website, there have been 23 actions taken, with China frequently mentioned. It's worth noting here that these actions raise the prospect of a double diversion phenomenon or a cascade of trade diversion. First, the US raises barriers on imports from low-cost producers, who then redirect their goods to third countries like the EU, who in turn respond with further barriers to those low-cost producers, who then move on again to direct their large flows of exports to an ever smaller target group of open export markets. And naturally, the UK comes to mind as one of those potential targets. So finally, let's turn to the UK. Most of our imports actually come from Europe, and UK goods import prices have been trending down for a few years now, weighing on aggregate inflation. They are, of course, much higher than before COVID because we had a burst of inflation, as are world export prices. But I would expect that the overall trend will continue and may even accelerate as trade diversion picks up around the world, at least so long as the UK remains relatively open and takes a few protectionist steps of its own. Let me end with just an anecdotal example of this trend, and that is the phenomenon of electric vehicles, and specifically battery electric vehicles, or BEVs. As the BBC recently reported in a story over the last few days, in the latest vehicle registration data for September, roughly 300,000 cars were registered in the UK. Of these, more than half were electric and about 1/4 were BEV only. And this is the first year when hybrids and BEVs have reached those milestones. And the growth is, I guess, expected to continue in these sectors, and it's been very strong. Growth in hybrid and BEV segments has been over 30% year on year. Now, significantly, among the 10 best-selling cars in the UK were 2 Chinese models in that September registration data. And with the US not welcoming such cars, and with the EU applying protective measures, especially against the lowest cost Chinese EVs, these trends may well accelerate and intensify for the UK. Now, that's an anecdotal example, but I believe the same price pressures will unfold not just for automobiles and BEVs, but for many manufactured intermediate and final products. And those kind of developments are of a piece with the trade diversion story that I'm trying to tell. And I believe that there is going to be more of that kind of trade diversion ahead. So let me turn, in conclusion, to the monetary policy implications of trade diversion and how I see them in the context of my view of the outlook on the macroeconomy. Now, my current view is one of a preponderance of downside risks, which I see as having increased steadily over the last 12 months. The UK economy has slowed and output has fallen below potential. Slack has opened up in the labour market. Confidence indicators of businesses and households have drifted to very low levels, and the trend of underlying disinflation has continued. Notably, that trend underlying disinflation, has been led by strong reductions in wage settlements, which look to be ending this year in the mid 3% range, and are likely to be closer to, if not below 3%, next year. And as I see it, in an economy with rising unemployment and weak demand, wage settlements will be pushed down, and wage-led domestic inflation will not rekindle an upward spiral. Let me briefly show this chart, which was also shown by my MPC colleague, Catherine Mann, last week. Now, every line in this chart is a probability density function. I did say I was in the mathematical tripos, so I thought I had to come in with like some like density function or something exotic. And what are these probability densities? They're taken from a GDP nowcast in a quantile regression model, which tries to not just give you a central estimate of what GDP growth will be in a particular quarter, but its likely distribution based on observable data from the past and the latest observations. And every line here is a GDP nowcast for a particular quarter over the last 12 months. Now, whereas for the previous 3 quarters, probability mass was concentrated in positive territory, indicating an expectation of expansion, in the latest quarter, the aqua line for September, you can see more mass has shifted to the left. And it's actually bimodal with a quite pronounced hump. The bigger hump is now kind of sitting near 0. So we're sort of, flirting with recession here, with negative growth. So from the perspective of this model, the likelihood of contraction in the 3rd quarter, the one for which we're now awaiting data, is now 27%. It's about getting close to 1/3. And that's the highest number we've had this year across all those different probability distributions. Now, set against all this in terms of upside risk, most inflation expectation measures remain moderate. And we have an inflation hump right now in 2025, which, while yet to dissipate, should do so in early 2026, when the taxes and administered price hikes from earlier this year, from January through April, start to roll off and fall out of the CPI. Still, I see the upside risk to inflation as low compared to the downward trajectory in output and inflation fundamentals. And it's this view that has led me to dissent in 5 of the last 7 votes on the MPC in favour of a lower path for bank rate as a form of insurance against these downside risks. So I now see 3 plausible scenarios for 2026. Let me end with those. The first scenario is the soft landing, and I saw this as the most likely outcome in January when I gave my first speech in Leeds. But the developments I've just described mean that this outcome is receding in terms of probability. By maintaining what I think is a too restrictive path of interest rates, we may have braked too hard, such that inflation cannot smoothly return to target with the economy close to potential. And that's what my votes have indicated. The second scenario might be called the bumpy landing, one which I think is increasingly likely, a downside scenario, where inflation undershoots its target, going below, possibly in late 2026, and the economy moves into a weakened state for a sustained period, with output and employment below potential, leading to undue damage to economic activity. Part of this scenario, in my mind, could end up resulting from some of the trade diversion pressures that I've been talking about today. And if we underestimate the forces of trade diversion, as they may apply to the prices we see on imported goods, all those goods washing up on our shores in the next year or two, then our inflation forecasts could miss the mark. The third scenario is what you might call the hard landing, which is a deeper worry. This was a remote and low probability about a year ago, but I think the risk is rising. In this scenario, weak demand at home can lead to a more forceful downturn, where recession dynamics start to kick in. And those can be very difficult to contain, much less reverse, as history shows. As I just said, the economy has been flirting with 0 growth, and the realization of negative readings could easily change the future path for the worse. The probability of this outcome is now not trivial. This would be a downside to the downside scenario, if you will, and it would lead to an even more dramatic inflation undershoot than the second scenario. To end up here would be a mistake. I will be looking carefully at the domestic dynamics, especially in the labour market and wages, as well as output and business sentiment indicators, to see where we are on these 3 different possible trajectories. But I also remain alert to the risk that, as in our long history as an open trading nation, we may also be buffeted by significant shocks from the rest of the world. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much indeed for that fascinating talk. As I said, we're extremely lucky to have Alan here, because he's not only, as you see, a fascinating economist, but having this vital role at this very sensitive juncture in UK economic history is very important, and we're very proud of having you as part of our King's alumni. I should also say that you did indeed read maths here, and Martin Hyland was your former Director of Studies, I believe, or supervisor, who sadly couldn't be here today, but sends you his very best wishes, and I'm sure he'll be very proud of the maths we just saw up there. I'm going to ask one quick question and then chuck it open for questions, because I know we haven't got very long, because you have to rush off quite soon. Essentially what you're saying here is that the UK is one of the few countries left in the G7 that still believes in free trade, because the US and China are both erecting all kinds of barriers, and the EU is scrambling to follow. And the problem about a world of geoeconomics and mercantilism is that it's very hard for one player to stay virtuous while everyone else is engaging in vice. Does the UK need to follow the EU and others in erecting trade barriers to protect itself? Or is it just going to end up being buffeted by everyone else because it's either trying to be virtuous, somewhat hopelessly, or it has no choice?
Thank you, Gillian. I did say beforehand, I'm going to have to be very careful with the questions Gillian throws at me. So I'm not here to comment on UK trade policy or make proposals to that end, as that's not the role of the Bank of England. So I think, I hope we make wise choices. But you're right, in terms of the historical context, we're a small country. And, there are many some trade economists here in the audience, and we can go through the arguments of whether a tariff is optimal or not, and maybe for large countries that can, have some market power, there are cases for, using trade barriers here or there as part of an overall strategy, could be part of an industrial strategy or whatever. But we know for a small country, you're basically a price taker. Whatever's going on in the rest of the world, there's the oil price, there's the price of some other commodities, some manufactured goods. And for the most part, tariffs are going to be a friction for you, but you're not going to be able to necessarily get a lot of traction in terms of an optimal tariff. So I think that's the standard textbook response. That is not the Alan Taylor response. That I'm just quoting the textbook there. And that seems to be the response that we're pursuing at the moment. But I think your question is pertinent. Do we know what will happen next as this plays out, and what the other blocs will do? Where will we be a year from now? I don't even know where we'll be a week from now.
We were joking before that you'd written a speech on Thursday before we had the latest round of US-China tariffs or threatened tariffs that suddenly caused the markets to crash. I mean, it's moving very fast, isn't it?
I mean, it's been sort of like that since the start of the year, that there have been so many announcements. I think, yes, it was at the Treasury Select Committee, where I've been there 3 times, and the chair of the Treasury Select Committee said at one point, we've been monitoring your monetary policy reports, and the word count for the word uncertainty, keeps rising with each successive Bank of England publication. So I'm trying not to use that word anymore now, because I'm sort of self-conscious about it, but it's undeniable that it's there, and it's in all the objective measures of uncertainty as well, that are text-based or whatever. You can set the algorithms to work. It means that trying to make wise policy is hard when every week there's some new thing to think about.
Right. Well, the Bank of England gets prizes for honesty, if nothing else. And of course, as you say, there is a difference between today and the 1930s in terms of the fact the 1930s was symmetric trade shocks. Now we're facing asymmetric, ever-changing trade shocks. And of course, the other difference was in the 1930s, the UK was a dominant player in the global economy, and it's not now. And that's in some ways the biggest difference of all.
Yeah, I mean, I think applying the lessons of history, I mean, it's exciting. It's the intellectual challenge I've been working on for 30 or 40 years. But it's full of pitfalls, because some things are comparable to events in the past, but you never have a perfect comparison. So you've always got to be aware of, well, what circumstances have changed, and am I drawing the right lessons? Or is there some important caveat where you say, okay, I have to take that into account. So I think it's a good discipline, because, sometimes, I mean, you could say this about COVID. We were reaching to, the economic history of pandemics and thinking what happened in 1918 and the global financial crisis, right? I mean, it's really fortunate that we had Ben Bernanke leading the Fed. And who was he? An economist, an economic historian, whose, great intellectual contributions were understanding how financial crises led to economic catastrophe in the 1930s. I mean, that's an inspiration, to anyone who becomes a central banker, to think of like, okay, how can I learn from the past? And it's now similar with trade policy. When was the last time we saw tariffs at these levels? It was the 1930s. So I think, keeping an eye on economic history is, I hope, good advice to all budding economists in the audience.
Well, on that note, before I turn it open for questions, so start thinking about what questions you want to ask. But we do have a lot of economic students here, many of whom I'm sure are thinking about public service, civil service in some ways. What advice would you give to economic students or students of economics who want to grow up and become like you? Who want to also sit on the Bank of England Monetary Policy Committee or whatever your central bank is at home, or run the finance ministry. Is it worth it? Is it hopeless? Is it exciting, inspiring?
Probably all of the above. There are a lot of questions there. But I have to say, first of all, I mean, when I was reminiscing about being here and walking through the bar and the Provost Lodge and walking around, just brings back old memories. But it's not like I was sitting here 41 years ago thinking, oh, I need to do A, then B, then C, and I'll have this career and it'll end up with me, being at the Bank of England and giving this. I mean, I think there's a lot of serendipity. When I was studying here, I was a mathematician. I didn't think about doing economics until maybe my third year, when I suddenly realized, oh, what am I going to do next? Maybe I don't want to be a mathematician. What do I want to think about studying and trying to do next? And I was interested in research. I wasn't then thinking of doing public policy. I think in the background it was like, okay, there are some economists out there doing real world things, but academics is not in the real world, as we say. But it's where you go to learn your skills and your craft. And then I think over time, my work has always had a historical flavour, but also kind of a policy question flavour to it. And then there's a sort of accidental set of things that led to me spending time at the Bank of England, getting more interested in that kind of set of questions, especially after the financial crisis, when my research went in the direction of history and macro and finance. But I think my advice is be open to your interests and follow, what you're interested in and what you're passionate about. I think that's what keeps you going. And keeps you energized. I still can't imagine retirement, even though, as you pointed out, we are quite young, but we're not as young as we used to be. But I think you've got to have an intellectual passion, and if it's economics, I think you've chosen well. There are so many things you can do with it, but just keep going every day. Pay attention to the world, because right now, the laboratory of the world is just incredible. What's going on? I'm not trying to imply that you should be lucky to be living through this time, because we don't know how it's going to turn out. But I think you can see, on the front pages in the news every day, the importance of economics and that people's livelihoods, careers, economies, sectors, the growth and the questions about technology and AI, which I know you cared about. We talked about those. But there are so many economic questions that are just right in front of us, and many risks around, the possibilities that they will throw up in terms of what's the path for growth, what's the path for trade, where will the world economy or our economy be a year or 10 years from now. So I think if those questions don't excite you, okay, but I think if they do, like they excite me, you will be rewarded by studying economics, and you will have options.
Absolutely. I must say it's very appropriate. We're sitting in the shadow of John Maynard Keynes over there, because in some ways the last time that economics was so febrile and fascinating was indeed during Keynes's era, and in many ways that was also an era where not only from this college but other academic economists got directly involved in policy making and quite deliberately made history. But anyway, any questions from anyone in the audience, from either students, or we've got one right at the back straight away. It'll be courteous but not compulsory to briefly identify yourself, and please keep your questions short so we can get as many as possible.
Quick question. Are you suggesting you should have a hard landing scenario in the November Monetary Policy Report? And have you made any progress in thinking about whether you should have the bank rate path attached to the separate scenarios?
Okay, very deep question, deep dive on monetary policy reports and what's coming in November. So the scenarios that I just described are the ones in my head. Of course, every MPC member has their own view and maybe thinking about a different balance of risks. So I'm not previewing any particular scenarios there in the report. But that's coming up, and new developments will be there as we continue post Bernanke review to improve the models, the forecasts, the communication. So we'll be looking at scenarios. We've said we're going to do that. That's going to be an important part of not just thinking about the baseline, but thinking about risks around the baseline. And that's never been more important than today. So I was giving you my particular way of thinking about the balance of risks. That may not be exactly what's in the monetary policy report, of course.
I do think that Professor Taylor is well equipped to be on the MPC because, King's alumni, for every 2 alumni you have 3 opinions. And certainly the MPC shows a variety of discussions and the ability to debate these very tricky issues. I think we had another question? Okay, over there.
Thank you. Hi, my name's Shmek. I'm a master's student here. You've obviously, as you mentioned, dissented a couple of times, kind of worried by this situation. Why do you think your colleagues and the markets aren't as concerned about this downside situation?
Well, I'll let
Great question.
Great question. And yeah, I'm going to be careful to let my colleagues speak for themselves, and I won't try to speak for them. I think it's very good that we have a wide range of opinions, right? That for a long time, we get tired of it, but for a long time we've been hearing the word groupthink thrown at the Bank of England. But I think the way we've been trying out our scenarios and considering a wide range of views, and individual members are expressing those views, very clearly and coherently, I think, speaks to the debate that's going on inside the room, and I think that's important. So it's not that we have 3 scenarios and somebody says, oh, it's that one, and someone else says it's that one. I think you have to think of it as being a distribution of probabilities, rather like the ones we were looking at. And even my own probabilities have been shifting around over the course of the year. So I think, in every round when you go into the meetings, you're making a case for what you think has changed, what the news has said, whether it's changing your own personal balance of risks. And then it goes to a vote. And, of course, we have a committee because we hope there's a wisdom of crowds. I guess 9 is a small crowd, but it's hopefully enough that when we get to the median voter, we're making a good decision. But it's an evolving conversation. But it is I think it's a good and healthy conversation. Yeah.
I've got lots of other questions I'd like to ask myself, but I don't want to squeeze out any students or anyone who wants to ask. Yes. One of the questions I want to ask is about central bank independence being under threat, but I'm sure you'll be relieved if you get diverted by students.
Hi, I'm Luke. I'm an economics postgrad here. Going to the trade diversion sort of thoughts, to what extent do you think the effect would be kind of a one-off disinflationary price adjustment, and then kind of to what extent do you think it might be a more persistent inflationary shock?
I think the standard way to think about tariffs is like taxes or other frictions. You're making a step change. But I think that historical example from the 30s showed that although it was really in 30, 31, 32, the initial wave of trade barriers went on, but then it took a long time, over the course of a decade, for trade to fully rearrange. So I think there could be a significant price effect on these goods, but it may not be felt all at one point. It could drip out over several years. Trade is partly an investment activity. There's an investment in relationships or building networks. It's not just simply moving a commodity from A to B. It's more complicated than that. And so we may not see these things hit immediately. And in that sense, it could be a disinflationary trend for a few years, depending on where the tariffs finally settle, which, as we just said, we don't really know. But I think for me, the baseline is to say, are we going back to the MFN, WTO, free trade levels of tariffs in most advanced economies, and everything will be like it was 12 months ago? I see that now as a remote possibility. There will be some frictions, and these tariffs that are here right now are probably here to stay for some considerable time. Could go higher, could go lower. But we have to now just reckon with this being the new normal state of affairs for trade policy. And I was trying to argue, based on the 30s, that did, that initial 1931 trade shock didn't immediately change trade patterns and prices, but it just ground away for several years. And I think that's what we have to anticipate.
Any more questions from students? I'm sure every question that comes, he doesn't have to talk about central bank independence and attacks on that by politicians.
Hi. Yes, sorry, it's not about central bank independence. I'm Rob, I'm a first-year PhD student. And how do you think that trade instability and all the frictions along this dimension interact with some brewing issues in the financial markets? As we know, the UK is a small open economy with a very massive financial market. So I would be interested in your thoughts on how those things can interact between one another.
Are you worried about a financial crisis?
Not presently, not as my number one worry. I'm mostly trying to focus on the developments in labour markets and trying to understand better the implications of the trade shock. Overall, we have, I think, a more robust financial regulatory system than we had before 2008. And we have households that are actually saving quite a lot. One of the kind of, quote, puzzles of the last couple of years has been, after COVID, and as interest rates are coming down, some expected that consumption would pick up and that would contribute to economic growth. But we've got levels of consumption in the UK that are staying pretty flat compared to the US pickup and even the EU. So I think the consumer is very cautious, and the flip side of that is growing savings balances. So I think if you just trace back leverage and mortgages back to the financial crisis, then people were taking on much more leverage and much more risk in terms of personal finance. And I think if you also look at on the corporate side and the bank side, I think we've kind of gotten over that shock and in a sense taken risk out of the system. That doesn't mean there's zero risk, it's a financial system, but that's not foremost in my mind right now. But I think the trade shock, that's not to say the trade shock couldn't have ripple effects, it could. But I'm more concerned about the ripple effects of these trade policy shocks on the real economy, which I think is the main focus right now.
I think we've got time for one last question only, I'm afraid. I think there was one question. Yeah, there. Happy last one, and then I think we'll have to wrap because he has got a very tight schedule.
Thanks. I'm Raf. I'm a master's student here. I was a bit surprised to see that Hong Kong and Vietnam saw the largest changes in inputs from Chinese exports. And so I'm wondering if this is an example of sort of passing through a third country, either origin washing or some trivial change to the good before passing it on to the US or to some third country. And so in a world with abruptly changing and large magnitude changes and frictions, how would this change your view on the trade flows and the policy response? Would it lead to overestimation or something like that?
I think it's very difficult to diagnose that exactly. How much is a kind of transshipment or rerouting versus finding new markets. So I think some of it is, and U.S. policy measures were aimed in certain points in time to try and put a stop to that too. So the U.S. directed some policy measures at Vietnam to try to prevent transshipment. So is it a phenomenon that happens? Yeah, it's very hard to measure because you don't necessarily see every point on that journey logged. But I think for most of those changes in trade volumes that you saw, it wasn't countries that were kind of prime suspects in transshipment. The offsetting flows were going all around the world. There was a very large flow to Africa, for example, as well as to the EU and even Latin American destinations. So I think there's just a handful of places where people have said these are likely transshipment points, but I think a lot of it is sort of pure trade diversion of the type I described, yeah.
Well, that's absolutely fascinating. I found it truly fascinating speech. I should say that anyone who wants to read it up and look at it again and look at the charts, you can find that on the Bank of England website. So do look there. All of his words and charts are up there.
Actually, a lot more words.
A lot more words are there.
I condensed
exactly. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
But it's a really valuable contribution to the current debate. And I really take away 3 points. One is that the UK really is in a pretty vulnerable, difficult position right now, since it is a small, open nation which is being buffeted by incredibly unpredictable forces outside its control. And how it adjusts and adapts, whether it's in terms of the potential for deflation or the problems around the loss of consumer confidence or the potential risks around recession, how it adapts in the next 12 months is going to be a critical task of policy making much more widely. Secondly, I do think the lessons from history right now are fascinating. I mean, yes, it's different from the 1930s, but I do think that there's an enormous benefit to bringing in these wider lessons, which brings me to my third point, which is, as I said at the beginning, if there was ever a time when it pays to be an economist, it is now. Your career should serve as an extraordinary inspiration to all students because, as you said, you came from Yorkshire. I believe you're first generation student here at Cambridge. You came in as a maths student. You told me once before that you arrived and you almost ran away immediately because you thought you didn't fit in. And it was really down to Martin Hyland, one of our fellows, who reassured you that you could fit in and you did have a place here, even as a first generation from up north. And you've gone on to an extraordinary career in ways that you never imagined. And you really are at the pinnacle of economic policy making in many ways. And so I hope it inspires you all, because you never know where you're going to end up in the future. But it could be also in an extraordinarily influential role in 10, 20, 30 years' time. So thank you so much for sharing the lessons.
Thank you all.
Here is your future group of MPC policy members one day. And to all of you and you, very best of luck. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you so much.